What's up guys, Nathan here. Today I've got a fun new Path of Exile series to introduce. It's called Casual Guides for Casual Players of Path of Exile. But Path of Exile guides, they're pretty good, check them out. Thanks. Today's guide is a slightly new twist on an old build, the Flameblast Totems Hierophant, also known as Pizza Sticks. Really quick though, I highly recommend anyone watching this video to go check out Viper-esque's version of this guide. It heavily inspired my own and is a super safe option for those looking to maximize their survivability at the expense of some damage. Link in the description below. Anyway, back to the guide. Those of you who've been playing for a while will probably remember this build used to really shine before the great double dipping nerfs. Since then, the build has heavily dropped in popularity, so much so that literally no one in softcore incursion above level 94 is playing it. However, I believe with the recent buffs to Flameblast's Ignite chance and the introduction of the Combustion support gem, Pizza Sticks are back. So, let's start with the pros and cons of this build. The pros are as follows. The build is cheap from start to finish, costing no more than a couple of chaos to get you well into yellow maps. The build has extremely high damage with around 1 million Shaper DPS on only a 5 link. High survivability with 500 plus mana and life regen, 8,000 effective HP with Mind Over Matter, and a safe totem playstyle. Strong bossing, being able to one-shot map bosses and instantly phase bosses like Azaro and Itsiri. Can do literally all map mods with some minor flask swapping. Next up, let's look at the cons. Feels crappy until you get a good amount of cast speed. Self-cursing can get a little dangerous if you don't flask it away correctly. Not everyone enjoys totems, for some reason. Not exactly the fastest mapper. And it's not Glacial Cascade. That being said, the new Combustion support allows for some pretty impressive fire resistance reductions, so this build might actually have better bossing potential. Now, before I jump into the skill tree and gearing portion of this guide, I want to talk about the playstyle of the build. Everyone loves to talk about how boring totem builds are, but I found them to be far more engaging than expected. There are a couple of ways to play. If you overgear the content, you can shield charge around wildly, dropping totems in the middle of packs as you go. If the content or map mods are a little more dicey, you just go more slowly, casting Flammability to proc Arcane Surge, and putting a couple of totems in front of whatever pack you want to blow up. When it comes to serious bosses, just gem swap increased AoE for concentrated effect, spam totems until you have 10 curses on you, then pull the boss. The tricky part is actually making sure the boss doesn't move too much while the flame blasts are charging up. For example, when doing Azaro, I like to walk around him in a circle, which forces him not only to stay in place, but allows me to automatically sidestep most of his more dangerous attacks. With just a little luck, you'll phase or kill him instantly, and suddenly having a trillion curses on you isn't that big of a deal. Speaking of self-cursing, I should probably explain a little more in detail how the build functions and why I'm able to instantly kill Act 10 Kitava with just a Bright Beak. On bosses, and to a lesser extent mapping, a huge chunk of your damage comes from the interaction between Soul Mantle and the Self-Flagellation Jewel. Soul Mantle is a free 7 link for spell totem builds that also lets you summon an additional totem, but it has the massive downside of inflicting you with a random level 20 curse when a totem dies. Plus, curses from Soul Mantle actually ignore the usual 1 curse per player limit, so it's pretty easy to debuff yourself into oblivion in just a few short seconds. The build starts to get interesting when you include a few more uniques. The Self-Flagellation Jewel, which gives you around 15% increased spell damage per curse on you, and 2 Kikazaru rings. This works out to 80% reduced effect of curses on you, allowing you to all but ignore the string of scary looking debuffs at the top of your screen. That, and you'll be chilling with anywhere from 50 to 200% increased spell damage, depending on how aggressively you continue to place your totems. Next up, I've linked the path of building and skill tree below. The gist of it is I focus on totem, spell crit, life, and mana nodes. I go Mind Over Matter fairly early, help Illyria, and eventually make my way over to the shadow side of the tree. When leveling, I chose to go Ancestral Bond very early and level with Firestorm totems until I got Flameblast. The recommended ascendancy order is Pursuit of Faith, Ritual of Awakening, Divine Guidance, then Conviction of Power. These can actually be swapped around for more survivability while leveling, but that's entirely up to you. Before we take a look at the gear, I should touch on the gem setups I'm using. I'll be listing them all in order of priority, and unless I specify otherwise, they should be as high level as possible. Your main setup is Vol Flameblast, faster casting, increased AoE or concentrated effect depending on the content you're doing, combustion support, controlled destruction, and fire penetration socketed in your soul mantle for that free 7 link. A couple of notes though. You might find it easier to use a regular Flameblast gem here, and a level 21 version will certainly be easier and cheaper to find, but I think the Vol version is way more fun. Additionally, the reason why I'm using Combustion instead of Elemental Focus is because it's actually more damage against endgame bosses once you manage to ignite, which is insanely easy to do so with this setup. Your mobility setup is the standard Shield Charge, Faster Attacks, Fortify. If you feel like 4-linking, you can throw in a 20 quality Culling Strike, but that's definitely not required. For some added survivability, I recommend an auto-casting Immortal Call setup consisting of a level 10 Immortal Call, a level 10 cast when damage taken, and increased duration. Because we have reasonable endurance charge generation, I like this setup to trigger only when it has to, as there's no reason to be getting rid of all of our charges every time an enemy breathes on you. Your cursing setup should be as follows. Flammability, increased duration, increased area of effect, and a level 11 Arcane Surge. This allows us not only to increase the fire damage taken by the enemies we curse, but procs Arcane Surge, giving us much appreciated cast speed, spell damage, and mana regen. The last setup I recommend is a Lightning Golem for some additional cast and attack speed. I don't like worrying about my golem dying all the time, so I link mine up as Summon Lightning Golem, Minion Life, and Minion and Totem Elemental Resistance. This is optional, but highly recommended. The following don't need to be linked to anything, but are important in their own right. Herald of Ash is a nice little more damage multiplier for our spell and burning damage, and Portal is a solid quality of life choice that pairs nicely with all of our cast speed. Anger is also an option, but you'd be reserving a ton of mana, which would greatly hurt your ability to successfully utilize Mind over Matter. So you may be thinking,
wow, Nathan, this build seems pretty amazing. It must cost several exalts to get started.
Luckily, you'd be dead wrong. All the required uniques don't cost more than a few chaos, and a 5-linked Soul Mantle is more than enough damage to do all content. Here's a list of all the gear you'll need. There are a ton of options for weapon slots, so you should let your budget decide. You could use a Divinarius, Doriani's Catalyst, or even a Brightbeak. I'm personally using a 5 Chaos rare spell damage dagger, which isn't required, but I wanted to splurge for some extra cast speed. Your offhand should be a spell damage shield, like Wrathpith's Shield, or in my case, a rare with some life and resists. For more damage, you could use 2 high spell damage daggers, but I personally don't think that's necessary. As I mentioned before, your jewelry isn't super flexible. Both of your ring slots need to be Kikazaru's, or you're gonna have a bad time. The only exception to this is if you somehow have an Itsiri's Reflection, in which case you probably don't need to be watching this guide in the first place. Your amulet should have as many offensive stats as possible, and your belt should have as many defensive stats as possible. I'll get more into the specific stats you want to look for in just a minute, but just know that rares are generally better than uniques when looking to fill these 2 slots. For your chest, you need to have a Soul Mantle. The stats aren't super important, so you can literally buy one for 1 alch. I do recommend at least 5-linking it, but you should be able to get into early mapping with just a 4-link. Your gloves, boots, and helm can all be rare and should be used primarily to overcap your resists to account for the self-cursing, but should also provide life, mana, and energy shield to bulk up your layers of defense. I'm personally using a Starkonja's Head with Flameblast damage enchant, but that's just because I was able to find one for only 20 chaos. For jewels, the gearing process is again pretty simple. You'll want 2 uniques, the Stone of Spire and Self-Flagellation. The former is dirt cheap, and the latter ranges from 1 chaos to quite a bit more depending on how it's rolled. The build also makes room for 1 more jewel, and I personally recommend a rare with as much cast speed as you can get. The last part of your gear is your flasks. I personally recommend 2 Divine Bubbling Life Flasks, one of Staunching and one of Heat. I also use a Quicksilver Flask of Warding because sometimes the self-cursing gets to be a little too dangerous. This can also be a Basalt Flask if you'd prefer. For your DPS flasks, I recommend a Series Promise and a Diamond Flask. They will almost double your DPS, so do not neglect to pick these up. We're almost done, but I quickly want to touch on the stat priorities when choosing your rare gear. The most important stats are as follows. Resists, overcapped to account for self-cursing. Life, preferably at least 70 on every rare that can roll it. Mana, enough so that you have at least 40% as much unreserved mana as you do life. As much cast speed as you can get. The less important, albeit still valuable stats are as follows. Energy Shield. Spell damage. Global or spell crit chance or multi. Added fire damage to spells. Attack and movement speed. And that about wraps up the build guide. As I stated at the beginning of the video, this guide is heavily based off Viper-esque's variant, which I will leave a link to below. He has offered to accept PMs to help anyone with any concerns they may have, and I'd like to extend the same offer here. If you have any questions about this guide or Path of Exile in general, feel free to leave them here. My character profile is also public, so feel free to check that out if you want to see a suboptimal version of the build in action. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video guide. My name is Nathan, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you!